It was the middle of February 1943, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was sitting in his bunker right on the Tunisian border, penning a note to his wife Lucy. His boys had just steamrolled the American lines at Kasserine Pass. Outside, the Afrika Korps was popping champagne. Inside, Rommel was dissecting what made the enemy tick. The letter didn't pull any punches. Rommel told her the Yanks were soft, lacked real discipline, and were led by clowns who would have been court-martialed in any respectable European military. He had just watched the American army crumble and flee at Kasserine. 6,000 casualties in 6 days. Whole battalions throwing in the towel. Gear left rotting in the sand. It looked exactly like the collapse he had witnessed with the French back in 1940. The U.S. forces didn't just lose, they were embarrassed. Kids who had grown up on legends of Great War heroism were suddenly wondering if they were built for this. Rommel didn't just see a tactical gap. He believed he was watching the American will to fight shatter in real time. He told Lucy that if the Reich punched them again in a few weeks, they could drive the Americans right into the ocean. Before they figured out which end of the gun goes bang, he sent this analysis to Berlin. Hit them while they're down, don't let them breathe. Rommel's take wasn't just arrogance. It was based on cold, hard data. At Kasserine Pass, the American war machine showed massive cracks in the foundation. Their leaders put troops in useless spots, radio silence when it mattered. Tanks and foot soldiers operated like strangers. The moment the Panzers rolled in U.S. units, routed without orders, triggering a domino effect of pure terror. The guy in charge of 2 Corps Major General Lloyd Fredendall had dug a bunker 70 miles away from the action. He tried running a war by phone, completely blind to the reality on the ground. His orders were a mess. German spies took notes on all of it. The gear was decent. The soldiers were scrappy when trapped. But the leadership was amateur hour. These guys had never tangled with the Wehrmacht before. They were trying to learn the art of war against the best in the business. Rommel crunched the numbers. It would take the Americans 6 months minimum to fix their brass, probably 12 months to get their tactics right. If Germany hit them again in March, it would be Kasserine Part 2. The German Panzer playbook had crushed everyone since 1939. Find a weak spot. Hammer it with everything you have. Drive the tanks through. Use speed to widen the gap, surround them or make them run. This strategy broke the French in 6 weeks. It erased the Soviets in 1941. It kicked the British all over North Africa twice. It worked because the enemy usually sat still, trying to hold a line that German speed made irrelevant. Kasserine proved the Americans were playing by the same old rules. They dug holes and waited for the hammer to drop. When the Panzers showed up, the Americans chose flight over fight. Rommel eyed the map around El Guettar. It looked like the perfect stage for an encore. A German strike there in late March would catch the Yanks licking their wounds from the last beating. Breaking their mind would be enough to win the battle. Berlin gave the green light. One solid push would shatter U.S. morale for good. Then they could turn back to the British while the Americans packed their bags. But then the intel reports shifted. New boss in town. Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. took over 2 Corps on March 6, 1943, the same broken unit that fell apart at Kasserine. When Patton rolled up to HQ, the vibe shifted instantly. He arrived in a motorcade with sirens screaming, rocking those signature ivory-handled pistols. He didn't just give orders, he laid down the law. The party was over. Patton made everyone wear ties and helmets, even in the scorching heat. Not because he liked fashion, but to remind them they were warriors, not a mob of refugees. Officers looking sloppy got fined right there. Troops who forgot to salute got chewed out in front of everyone. But surely one general couldn't fix a rot that deep in 3 weeks. That was the German view. Maybe he'd boost spirits a bit. Maybe they'd tuck their shirts in. But teaching a whole corps how to fight in under a month, impossible. Rommel was getting sicker by the day. His gut was killing him. But his strategic instincts were razor sharp. He gave the El Guettar assault blueprints one final review before handing the keys to the operation over to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. The entire strategy banked on the Americans playing a static defense. It banked on them freezing up when the heat turned up. It relied on the idea that 3 weeks was nowhere near enough time to fix a broken military. These weren't wild guesses. They were logical bets based on how the Germans had crushed every other enemy. Then came March 22nd, 1943. The Wehrmacht geared up to smash the American lines near El Guettar. The lineup was heavy, featuring the 10th Panzer Division with their Mark V tanks, alongside the battle-hardened Italian Centauro Division. Commanders told their men exactly what to expect. The Americans would sit in their holes. When the German armor massed for a punch, the Yanks would scream for air cover that probably wouldn't show up. If you pushed them hard enough, they would break and run just like they did at Kasserine. The German armor held all the aces in firepower and protection. Their 75mm cannons could punch through a Sherman from 2,000 yards out. The American crews had to get within 500 yards to even scratch the paint. That range advantage was practically a cheat code in the open desert. German artillery plotted grid squares to keep the American heads down. The whole game plan was just a rerun of the Kasserine slaughter. March 23rd, 1943, sun up over El Guettar. The Axis forces rolled out, marking down a wind before the first shot. They were about to learn the hard way that 3 weeks is a lifetime in war. The show started at 6 in the morning. The spearhead of the 10th Panzer drove straight at the American lines held by the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. The skies were clear. The ground was solid. It looked like a textbook operation. The infantry stood their ground under heavy fire until the command came down. When they moved back, they dug in and kept shooting. They weren't running away. They were executing tactical retreats that kept the unit tight while making the Germans pay in blood. For every inch. On the right flank, the Italian Centauro division hit a wall. American counterfire was keeping their infantry face down in the dirt. Every time they tried to move, machine guns cut them down from interlocking angles. The Americans had prepped the kill box perfectly. By noon, the drive stalled out at the 3,000-yard mark. This definitely wasn't the cakewalk Kasserine had promised. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, running the show in Tunisia after Rommel flew out, got the bad news at HQ. The offensive was going nowhere. The resistance was disciplined and lethal. Body counts were rising, but the Americans weren't breaking. It went against every intelligence report on his desk. Von Arnim looked at the maps with a sinking feeling. The game had fundamentally changed. Everything had shifted. Sure, the Shermans were still outclassed by German steel, and the landscape wasn't much different from Kasserine Pass, but the American troops fighting here were unrecognizable. They were hitting back with a ferocity and teamwork the Wehrmacht never saw coming. Intercepted radio chatter picked up U.S. officers sounding calm, collected, and totally in control. Their artillery was dropping shells with surgical accuracy, and the infantry was charging forward instead of routing. This wasn't the broken army from 3 weeks ago. By March 24th, General von Arnim had seen enough to call off the entire operation. The Germans were taking heavy losses without gaining an inch. The American defensive lines were just too tough to crack. The attack was scrapped and the German units retreated. Back at HQ, German intelligence scrambled to figure out what went wrong at El Guettar. They grilled American POWs and pored over paperwork scavenged from the battlefield. They were desperate to find the cause of this sudden transformation. It wasn't new gear. The Americans didn't have better tanks or massive reinforcements. They hadn't spent months drilling new strategies either. This massive shift happened in just 21 days under George Patton. His approach was blunt but revolutionary. Step 1, clean house. He sacked any officer who dithered and promoted the guys who showed grit. Leadership roles went to the men who understood that speed and violence win wars. Step 2, rewrite the playbook. Every single unit was drilled to counterattack the second they took fire. Artillery crews learned to mass their guns raining hell on specific targets to shatter the enemy. Defense didn't mean sitting in a hole anymore. It meant aggressive patrols and spoiling attacks. Step 3, fix the mindset. Patton made his men believe they were the best. Not with pep talks, but through grueling training that celebrated the fighters and penalized the timid. Units that kicked butt got public praise. Leaders who flopped were fired on the spot. The whole corps absorbed one mantra: attacking works. Hesitating gets you killed. German leadership broke down exactly what El Guettar meant regarding U.S. potential. The Yanks were using a style of fighting that basically nullified the German edge. See, the German game plan depended on smashing massed tanks through weak spots. The Americans countered that by setting up mobile anti-tank guns to trap them in deadly crossfire. Suddenly pushing forward cost the Germans dearly, no matter how good their armor was. German tactics assumed the enemy would fold under pressure. But the new American rulebook called for instant counterattacks that killed any forward momentum. What started as a sure win turned into a desperate scrap for survival. The German way focused on tech and individual brilliance. The American way was about teamwork and unleashing an absolute wall of firepower. The Germans banked on the skills of their tank aces. The Americans answered with the sheer weight of industrial warfare. Utilizing time-on-target artillery strikes. It was a factory-made symphony of destruction. For the German grunts, it felt like the sky was collapsing. They weren't battling individual soldiers anymore. They were fighting a finely tuned machine that had finally hit its stride. The U.S. wasn't trying to beat German engineering man-to-man. They were rendering that engineering useless through superior organization. Rommel had actually jotted down some notes on this before he bailed out of Tunisia. He realized the Americans learned faster than anyone Germany had ever fought. They spotted their flaws at Kasserine and fixed the whole mess in just 3 weeks. Beating them in the future would take a lot more men and a totally different game plan. Back on March 6, 1943, 2 huge things went down at once. In Tunisia, Rommel kicked off his last big push in North Africa, attacking the British 8th Army at Medellin. It was a one-day catastrophe. The British stopped the Panzers dead in their tracks with a web of anti-tank fire. The Germans took massive losses. The offensive fell apart in hours. On that very same day, George Patton took the reins of the U.S. Second Corps. Rommel was leaving just as Patton was stepping in. It was a symbolic changing of the guard. 3 days later, on March 9th, Rommel flew back to Germany on sick leave. The guy was falling apart physically. Jaundice and exhaustion were taking their toll. He'd never set foot in Africa again. But before he took off, Rommel penned some updated memos for the generals staying behind. His tone was way different from his letters back in February. He warned them that under this new leadership, the Americans were getting better fast. No one should expect future battles to be a cakewalk like Kasserine. Sadly for them, Rommel's heads-up arrived too late. The battle at El Guettar on March 23rd proved he was spot on. The German commanders who brushed off his advice realized too late that the Americans had undergone a total metamorphosis. But by the time history proved him right, he was already back on German soil. On May 13th, 1943, the German forces in Tunisia finally threw in the towel. We're talking more than 250,000 Axis prisoners. The North African show was a wrap. The Yanks had gone from the embarrassment at Kasserine Pass to a total knockout in Tunisia in under 3 months. The German brass analyzed this new American performance and immediately sent out fresh tactical orders. They told their defenders to watch out. The Americans were coming with aggressive speed armor blitzes and heavy artillery. The Germans were frantically rewriting their playbook. But when the Allies hit the beaches of Sicily on July 10th, 1943, those warnings turned out to be dead on. Patton's 7th Army didn't just land. They stormed up the western coast. Patton smashed into Messina on August 17th, beating the British to the punch, in a race that showcased just how superior American firepower had become. German reports from the front were grim. The mix of American aggression and endless supplies made holding the line basically impossible. Fast forward to June 1944. Rommel was in charge of the German defense against the looming Allied invasion of France. He set up a defense strategy specifically tailored to stop that aggressive American style he knew was coming. Rommel wanted his mobile reserves parked right next to the likely landing zones. He knew the Americans would try to break out inland the second they hit the sand. The Germans had to counterattack instantly before the Americans could build up any steam. Rommel's view on the Americans had done a complete 180 since his letters back in February 1943, where he'd laughed at how soft they were. Now he was writing that the Americans were actually far ahead of the British in their tactical thinking. They married their overwhelming resources with a punchy fighting style that made sitting in static defenses a suicide mission. When D-Day finally dropped on June 6, 1944, Rommel's plans were gutted because Hitler refused to release the Panzer reserves. But Rommel called it right. At Utah and Omaha beaches, American troops took a beating but kept pushing inland with relentless aggression. Rommel grasped the truth that other German generals were still struggling to wrap their heads around. The Americans weren't that green, clumsy force he'd crushed at Kasserine Pass anymore. They were now a professional war machine, built to crush enemies by combining brute force with smart tactics. After the Reich fell, Allied interrogators sat down with captured German generals to debrief them on American performance. What they heard was consistent and eye-opening. It sounded almost like a collective confession. When heavy hitters like Hasso von Manteuffel and Albert Kesselring sat in those interrogation rooms in 1945, a theme kept popping up: begrudging respect. They admitted they'd expected the Americans to be like the French or the early Soviets, slow on the uptake and easy to break. Instead, they ran into an enemy that evolved at a speed that honestly felt unfair. General von Manteuffel, who led panzer forces against the U.S. from 1944 to 45, said the Americans learned faster than any army Germany had ever fought. They'd spot a weakness and fix it in weeks, not months. Field Marshal Kesselring testified that American artillery coordination was the deadliest he'd seen in 6 years of war. The speed at which Americans could rain fire on a specific target rendered German tactical doctrine obsolete. German generals stressed that this transformation wasn't just about having better toys. The Soviets had great tanks, the British had veteran soldiers, but the Americans were different. They figured out how to combine their material advantage with an aggressive doctrine that made winning inevitable. The consensus among the German pros was that the American army of 1945 was a totally different beast from the 1943 version. The same outfit that got humiliated at Kasserine Pass had morphed into one of the most effective fighting forces in history. The Germans didn't just lose the war, they lost their sense of superiority. Rommel's initial take after Kasserine was logical, based on everything the Germans knew. Armies usually need years to build a doctrine. Officers usually need tons of combat experience to lead. And soldiers need months of training to fight like pros. Patton proved that logic dead wrong in just 3 weeks. You could see the change at El Guettar, but it took 90 days from the mess at Kasserine in February to the victory in Tunisia in May. For the German commanders to finally accept that this American improvement was permanent, not just a fluke, The first 3 weeks rewrote the rulebook. The next 2 months proved the change was here to stay. By May 13, 1943, when over 250,000 Axis troops surrendered, the German generals knew the amateurs of Kasserine were gone forever. Leadership mattered more than experience. A solid doctrine mattered more than the equipment itself. An aggressive mindset trumped technical superiority. Sure, the Germans built better tanks, but the United States forged a superior warfighting philosophy. That approach proved decisive during the clash at El Guettar and kept delivering victories from the Sicilian coast to the sands of Normandy. That winning streak tore through France and pierced the heart of the Reich. The 90 days separating the humiliation at Kasserine Pass from the victory in Tunisia did more than just recover ground. They rewrote the history of the 20th century. That was the instant the sleeping giant finally sharpened its blade. Nazi commanders abruptly quit dismissing the GIs as amateurs. By May 1943, they grasped a terrifying truth: the enemy staring back at them wasn't some lost traveler. He was the engineer guaranteeing their total destruction.